COP27। अब COP27 क्या था? श्रृंखला में हमने जाना, पहले तो COP26 के ऊपर मैंने एक वीडियो बनाई, वो आप देख सकते हैं। उसके बाद COP27, अब एक COP28 भी है, तो इसको भी जानेंगे। फ़िलहाल ये वीडियो COP27 के ऊपर मैंने बनाई है, जो कि 2022 में हुआ था। ये 27th यूनाइटेड नेशंस क्लाइमेट चेंज कॉन्फ्रेंस है, was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt from November 6 to 2022. More than 35,000 participants from various governments, organizations and the private sector gathered to discuss the progress and challenges in global climate action. The conference built on the agreements from COP26 in Glasgow and aimed to push forward measures to combat climate change with a strong focus on climate finance, adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage. Despite some frustrations over slow progress in certain areas, the summit was viewed as a critical step toward addressing the needs of developing countries that are facing the harshest impacts of climate change. Key agreements and outcomes of COP27. Number 1. Establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. ये सबसे important मुद्दा है इसका. One of the most historic decisions at COP27 was the establishment of Loss and Damage Fund. This fund is designed to compensate vulnerable nations that are suffering from the effects of climate change, such as rising sea levels, flooding, droughts, and other extreme weather events. Developing nations, especially those in the global south, have been demanding such a fund for years. While the decision to create the fund was welcomed globally, details about who will contribute to it and how the money will be allocated were left to be determined by a transitional committee, which will present its recommendations at COP28 in 2023. Thereafter, climate finance. Climate finance remained a contentious issue at COP27. Developed countries had pledged to mobilize $100 billion annually by 2020 to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to climate change, but this target has still not been fully met. Many developing nations expressed frustration over the slow progress and emphasized that the funding being offered is often in the form of loans rather than grants, which could lead to greater debt burdens. In addition to fulfilling this overdue commitment, discussions focused on increasing the scale of funding and ensuring that financial flows are directed not just toward mitigation, reducing emissions, but also toward adaptation, coping with the impacts of climate change. Countries also urged reforms to institutions like multilateral development banks to ensure that they are more aligned with global climate goals. Number 3. Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda. This agenda was launched with the goal of making 3.3 billion people worldwide more resilient to climate impacts by 2030. The plan outlined measures to improve. क्या improve करना है? Food security, water management and disaster preparedness for vulnerable communities. It also focused on increasing financing for adaptation efforts, especially in regions most affected by climate-related hazards. Number 4. Mitigation and the global stock take. COP27 reaffirmed the global commitment to keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive, but progress in boosting mitigation efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions was limited. The conference saw some progress in terms of energy transitions, especially toward renewable energy sources, but no consensus was reached on calls to phase down coal or other fossil fuels. Many oil and gas producing nations resisted more aggressive language regarding the phasing out of fossil fuels. Countries were urged to revisit and strengthen their nationally determined contributions by 2023, especially in light of global stocktake, which will assess collective progress toward meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement in 2023. Methane emission reductions. Several nations continue to support the Global Methane Pledge, which seeks to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas, and efforts to curb its emissions are seen as crucial for achieving short term climate targets. Number 6. Just Energy Transition Partnerships. Building on the success of the South African Just Energy Transition Partnerships launched at COP26, new partnerships were announced for Indonesia and Vietnam to support their transition away from coal. These partnerships are designed to provide financial and technical assistance to help these countries move toward clean energy while ensuring that workers and communities affected by the transition are supported. India's role and commitments at COP27. India played a pivotal role in advocating for climate justice and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which stresses that developed nations should take a greater share of the responsibility for tackling climate change because of their historical contributions to greenhouse gas emissions. Number 1. Net zero emissions by 2070. India reiterated its net zero emissions target by 2070, which had been initially announced during COP26. India stressed that it would need financial and technological support from developed countries to meet its climate goals, including transitioning away from fossil fuels while continuing to meet its developmental need. Number 2. Energy transition. India highlighted its achievements in expanding renewable energy sources and reaffirmed its commitment to achieving 50% of its energy from non-fossil fuel sources by 2030. At the same time, India emphasized that coal remains crucial to its energy security, given the country's rapidly growing energy needs, and any transition away from coal would need to be gradual and just. Number 3. Support for Loss and Damage Fund. India strongly supported the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund, acknowledging the need for financial assistance to countries suffering the brunt of climate impacts despite contributing minimally to global emissions. Post COP27 developments and future outlook. The outcomes of COP27 set the stage for COP28, which is scheduled to take place in Dubai, UAE, in 2023. Key areas of focus for the next summit include implementation of the Loss and Damage Fund. The transitional committee established at COP27 will present recommendations on how the Loss and Damage Fund will be financed and governed at COP28. Global stock take. A key highlight of COP28 will be the global stock take, an evaluation of the world's progress toward meeting the Paris Agreement targets. This will involve a critical assessment of whether countries are on track to reduce emissions enough to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Strengthening NDCs. Countries will be under pressure to strengthen their NDCs and close the gap between current commitments and the actions needed to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. There will be a renewed focus on enhancing mitigation efforts and ramping up climate finance to achieve both mitigation and adaptation goals. Number 4. Energy transition and renewables. Discussions around phasing out fossil fuels and accelerating renewable energy adoption are expected to intensify at COP28. The global community will continue to push for stronger climate action, particularly from major emitters and fossil fuel dependent nations. To conclude, COP27 marked an important step forward in international climate negotiations, particularly with the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund, a long-standing demand from developing countries. However, significant challenges remain in closing the emissions gap, fulfilling climate finance commitments, and securing stronger mitigation efforts. Moving forward, the global community will need to ensure that the momentum from COP27 is maintained, particularly as countries prepare for the global stocktake at COP28. The continued focus will be on greater international cooperation, more ambitious national commitments, and ensuring that climate finance reaches those who need it most. Happy learning. Thank you.